Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it's what we'll remember in the end. My name is Alan Wake. I'm a writer.
Starting any creative work is arguably the most difficult part of the whole thing. The first line drawn, the first word written, the first movement taken or ingredient added, whatever the medium, the initial step can often feel like an insurmountable colossus standing between you and the creative release of finally putting your thoughts and ideas out into the world in a way that's more productive than, say, just sitting there contemplating for hours on end. It rarely ever goes as planned, though. All that time goes in, and yet what comes out is rarely perfect, if perfection is even a thing that can be said to exist in the first place. That line will probably be erased, words, whole sentences even, edited or excised entirely. The beginning is just that, a means to kick things off, a malleable piece of thought that sets things in motion but often needs to be reworked once the whole comes into view. I have to admit, this is not where I thought I'd be when I first sat down to replay Alan Wake. Though, if I'm being honest, I probably should have expected as much, given what Alan Wake has meant to me and my development into who I am today. That probably sounds like hyperbole, and to some degree it is. Hindsight does like to paint events with a more dramatic brush than they probably deserve. When Alan Wake first released back in 2010, it was easily one of my most anticipated games. This is despite the fact that I didn't have an Xbox 360. Even with exclusives galore from Halos to Gears to Mass Effects and more, Alan Wake managed to stand out, becoming the game I wanted a 360 for. I don't even know if I can say why exactly, it was just one of those games that felt undeniably up my alley. Luckily, I soon came into possession of a hand-me-down 360, and Alan Wake was the first game I purchased for it. I sat down, played through it in a haze, as was the norm back in those days when free time was both plentiful and readily wasted. And when I finished the game, I was left satisfied, though admittedly it wasn't quite as transcendent an experience as I had hoped. I want to stress that at the time and in the years leading up to my recent replay, I never had any ill will towards the game. It's actually a little strange when I think on it. I've had plenty of occasions where I was looking forward to something that didn't quite live up to the image I had in my mind, which ultimately colored my feelings for it in a more negative light thereafter. But that never happened with Alan Wake. Instead, it lived on as a solid experience, a game I'm happy I gave my time to despite it not clocking into my top 10 or matching up to the possible excitement I had going in. But the game did affect me, just not in ways immediately visible. An example of this is my fascination with Norse mythology. I'd always been a fan of myths and legends, primarily Greek and Egyptian, but for a long time I had very little knowledge of Norse myth beyond maybe knowing that Thor was a thing and had something to do with thunder and lightning and some such. Alan Wake has passing references to the Norse pantheon in the form of two retired rock stars who go by the names Thor and Odin. The music has overt references to these myths and the gods from whom they take their monikers, in addition to playing a crucial role in the story, funny enough. And while they piqued my interest, it was when players visit their farm in Alan Wake's 4th episode that really got me. As you guide Alan through various barns and other such structures, defeating enemies along the way, you eventually come upon one building in particular. Inside is a Viking longboat hanging from the ceiling. You know how impactful moments often transform in intervening years? An average winter day when your high school partner broke up with you suddenly becomes biting, with a chill that threatens to shatter thermometers whenever you think back on it. Similarly, I've recalled this moment in the barn so many times over the years in reference to it being what cemented my desire to learn more about Norse myths, eventually leading me to purchase several dictionaries on the subject, spend countless hours researching the topic, and ultimately inspiring my first complete piece of fiction that I was certain it had become skewed in my memory. But in replaying the game, I found that it was just as I remembered. The shadows, the building, the wood of the boat, nothing had really changed. That's part of the reason why I say Alan Wake led me here. To this moment, clacking away on a keyboard and reading off a script, even while I probably would have ended up drawn to Norse mythology in one way or another, and I would have probably ended up writing some capacity, and it had been a dream of mine since grade school, this particular iteration of who I am owes no small debt to the experience first playing the game back when I was most impressionable. And it's strangely fitting that Alan Wake would be the game to help solidify my creative path, given how much of its narrative is dedicated to dealing with the struggle that such a path carries with it. Alan is a writer. The whole reason the game kicks off is because he and Alice, his wife, decide to take a bit of a vacation to the small, seemingly innocuous town of Bright Falls to get away from the New York hustle and bustle, from the deadlines, the questions, the pressures of life that's been slowly but effectively pressing down on Alan, compacting him into a nearly inescapable box. See, Alan hasn't been able to write anything substantial for the past 2 years. After completing a successful series of crime novels, Alan has been stuck. At the time of his last book's publishing, he was beginning to feel he was ready to move on, to begin a new chapter of his life and writing career. But when that time finally came, he found that the fount of inspiration had run dry, and what was left behind was a writer who couldn't write. The man who thought he'd found his purpose in life now had to reckon with the reality in which that purpose eluded him. While it's not immediately apparent, Alan has not been doing well. Little things hint at it, one example being Alan's encounter with a fan of his at a diner upon first arriving at Bright Falls that sees him becoming increasingly annoyed with her gleeful fawning over one of her idols. But the first real clue comes later that night. Alan and Alice are in their cabin, relaxing, enjoying the first moments of freedom, and Alice tells him that she has a surprise. That surprise is a typewriter. At this point, she has more information than the players do. She's seen what the damage being unable to write these last 2 years has done to Alan and thought that the quiet of the cabin, the calmness of the lake, the warmth of it just being the two of them, could massage away the writer's block, bring him back to where he was before the spiral began. Alan doesn't see it this way. His immediate reaction to her surprise is anger and frustration as the pressures of the world outside their cabin come back. He then yells at her and storms out of the cabin even as the power goes out, leaving Alice, who has a crippling fear of the dark, terrified and alone. If Alan seems like an asshole, that's because he kind of is. It wouldn't surprise me if that's the impression the writers were going for coming off of this first half hour or so of the game. He also comes off a bit up his own ass with the whole I'm a writer shtick, only to then go off at a moment's notice whenever someone actually brings up his profession. There is a reason for this though. Alan's need to escape isn't exclusively from external forces. Since his writer's block first set in, Alan has slowly been succumbing to an intense sense of self-loathing, as he's been incapable of doing something that once came so easily to him. He's beginning to question if he's even capable of writing anymore, leading him to lash out at anything he sees as a reminder of his perceived failure. His ideal vacation would see him stepping out of his own skin, to stop being Alan the writer and just be Alan the person. So while it doesn't justify his actions, we can at least understand where his loathing of an encounter with an avid fan and erupting at the well-intentioned reveal of a typewriter stems from. There is a problem though. Alan cannot escape being a writer. It is so thoroughly a part of him, entwined with his sense of self, that everything about him ends up looping back to this one fact. That's part of the reason why I've come around on the opening monologue. The Stephen King quote, the assertion that he's a writer, always felt a tad forced and ham-fisted. As the game goes on, it starts to feel like those aspects are there because in the beginning of the game, Alan has to actively work to convince himself that he is still a writer. Going so long without writing has eaten away at his confidence and left him desperate to prove that he can still do it, and the delivery of these lines feels like a reflection of that. After he storms out, Alan hears a scream from the cabin. He rushes back, but finds the cabin empty and runs out to the dock where he sees Alice slowly slipping deeper into the lake. He dives in after her, but upon doing so, suddenly wakes up in the middle of a car wreck. A week has gone by since the incident at the cabin, and no one has seen Alice since. Alan has no memory of what occurred in the intervening days, but he begins to find manuscript pages supposedly written by him that seemingly foreshadow events that are yet to come. Convinced Alice must still be alive, Alan begins his search. Players eventually discover that Alan did in fact write the manuscript pages during the missing week, but it wasn't wholly of his own volition. Inspiration came in part from a whispered voice, a dark presence, hell-bent on escaping his confinement in a realm known as the Dark Place. When Alan jumped into the lake to save Alice, the dark presence pulled Alan in as well, trapping him along with it in the dark place. See, the words Alan writes there come true. The dark presence can use creation to conjure an escape for itself, and in Alan it has found a conduit for its freedom. And so it tells them what he wants to hear, that he will be able to write again. More than that, his words will have power, the ability to succeed where he failed. They will allow him to save Alice. Alan nearly loses himself to the dark presence. It offers everything he could have hoped for, an end to self-loathing in his inability to create, his failure as both a writer and a husband. But a small, nearly snuffed out piece of him manages to break through his guilt and desperation to write again no matter the cost. This piece reminds him that something about this is off, and begins to question whether or not anything he's doing will truly save Alice. The words he writes do have power, just as he was promised, but as the ending of the book begins to take shape, he sees that the only one getting what they want will be the dark presence. Realizing his mistake, he writes his escape from the dark place into the narrative and begins searching for a way to fix all that he has broken, to write a new ending. Creation is one of the most difficult endeavors one can undertake. Making something from nothing, producing works that move people, that take them from their typically mundane lives and place them into a new space. It's a skill many strive to possess, and it's one that frequently slips from one's grasp. Every new piece is just that, new. It doesn't matter how many books you've written, paintings finished, or scores composed, each time you begin anew with challenges strikingly unique to the piece at hand. And sometimes those challenges feel impossible to overcome, and so we force ourselves when the drive isn't there, berate ourselves for not producing something, and then hate ourselves when what we do produce isn't up to the quality we expect. Alan was not solely driven to write because of Alice. His intentions wore the guise of altruism, but really he was doing it because he couldn't stand the thought of not being able to any longer. Every day's inability ate away at him until he didn't hesitate to take the first option that carved out an easy path forward, regardless of whether or not that option was to deal with quite possibly a literal devil. And he paid for it. He witnessed the pain his hand wrought firsthand, all in the pursuit of selfishly returning to the highs he'd once achieved. His journey is one of reckoning with mistakes both past and present as he literally battles his own creation. And the conclusion he comes to on this journey is that none of this would have happened if he hadn't been there. And so, when he does get back to where it all began, he writes a new ending. Or more, a new beginning. A beginning without Alan Wake. Over the years, I have heard many a criticism of Alan Wake, from its mildly repetitive gameplay to its cast that could probably use a bit more fleshing out, to its taking liberally from its influences, namely Twin Peaks and Stephen King. And yeah, that's all there, but it also has so much nuance and commentary on art and being a creator, in addition to touching on things like depression and what it means to be a good partner, not to mention having a sentence or two to say on friendship and being true to yourself. One of my favorite moments comes when Barry, Alan's agent, outs himself as a Tolkien nerd, allowing him to carve out a niche for himself beyond being just another fast-talking Joe Pesci impersonator.
See this headlamp? It's like a superpower. I can just look at one of those things and they die. It's my flaming eye of Mordor. I wish I didn't say that.
Yeah.
Hey, I want a headlamp.
Last one.
Bastard.
That's all to say that I love this game, flaws and all, and there's so much more to it than I can even begin to address in reasonable time here. So, give it a shot, I say. Take a vacation out to Bright Falls for yourself. You never know what you might find.